It was quite a long time ago when I went to a fantasy convention in England, and somebody came up and said, "Oh, you're Graham Masterton, aren't you? Can I have your autograph?" And I felt quite good, but in another way, because I'd been a journalist and a reporter, a newspaper reporter before, I was quite used to seeing my name in print all the time. So seeing my name on a book wasn't probably as much of a thrill as it would be for a new author who'd never seen anything published before. Because even when I was 17 years old, on a local newspaper, I used to run a pop music page, and it was the Beat page by Graham Masterton, and that was every week in the locals. So I was quite. It wasn't particularly overexciting to see my name in print, but I was just used to it. But it was quite nice for somebody to actually recognise me and say, "Gosh, you know, I would like to have your autograph written down." In fact, on coming here today on the train from Warsaw to Poznan, there was a really nice girl on the train, and she found out who I was, and she was really excited. I find it a bit strange actually, but I thought she was really nice. So I did her an autograph in a book for her. In fact, I did a little drawing for her. A happy meeting on a train, with a little picture of her running along after a train. And but this is really nice actually, and I love meeting readers. I never call them fans, by the way, because I hate that word. They're not fans, you know. They're friends. They're people who read your books. You know, fans makes them sound like I'm Beyonce or somebody. You know, you want to talk about them. Yeah, but I think, to me, probably the most significant time that I got recognised in the street in Poland was 2 years ago. I'd been to a signing session at the bookstore and came back, and the girl who was driving with me took a wrong turning into a one-way street. So we were driving towards traffic coming towards us, headlights, you know, and I said to her, "I think we've gone the wrong way." You know. Excuse me. And of course there was immediate whoop, 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 police, you know. So I said, go down there, see if we can get away. So we went up the next street, and of course that was a one-way street as well. So they stopped us, and poor girl got out, and they said, "Where's your driving license?" and all the rest of it. But I got out, and I said, "Look, it's my fault. I told her to go that way, and I don't know Warsaw very well. So I'm sorry, you know, don't give her a hard time for doing that." And the policeman looked at me and he said, "Graham Masterton." This was at night in the middle of Warsaw, you know, in the rain. And he said, "But Graham, it's okay, yeah, we'll shake hands, you know, and all the rest of it." And they just let us go, "Bye." You know.
It's good.
That was the best time ever. That's the best part of any kind of being recognised. When I was young, I started reading the books of Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker and Jules Verne, stories like that. And some of them I thought were quite scary. But I've never been this kind of person who's really been frightened of things. I'm not frightened of the dark, and I'm not frightened of monsters. Or you're frightened of the dark, are you?
After this book, yes.
You were, in that case, talking about being frightened. I've just finished a short story, which was about the thing that seemed to frighten almost everybody. It's quite a simple story, but it's about a young boy who has a dressing gown or a bathrobe hanging on the back of his bedroom door. And of course it gets dark and the lights are turned off, and Mummy and Daddy go to bed. And the dressing gown, bathrobe, drops down from the door and runs out into the corridor. And I showed this story to a few people. It was published on a website, and people said that is the one thing that I know when I was a child that really, really frightened me, was clothes in my room hanging up in the dark, or maybe a jacket hanging over the back of a chair. Suddenly it's not a jacket, it's a hunchback monster over the back of the chair, and sort of things under the bed. That's the real fear. But I'm not frightened of things like that, and I never really have been. And to put it really frankly, I'm a seller, not a buyer. I don't scare easily. The only things that really scare me are things that threaten me, say physically, or my family, or my children or grandchildren. So I'm not scared of ghosts. The Manitou happened extraordinarily quickly. My agent from New York rang me up and said, Bill Girdler, who's this movie director who's done lots of what they call exploitation films, like Grizzly and Night of the Black Vampire and stuff, has went to Los Angeles airport, picked up a copy of the Manitou and wants to make a film of it. So I said, oh, all right, how much is he going to pay? And it was quite a lot, in fact, and bought a house on it. But so we said, fine. He did it really quickly, and within a week, they'd flown me out to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, and we were all sitting around the table signing the agreement. But when a film is made, you as the author, you don't get much say in it. You know, they write the script. They sent me the script to have a look at it, but if I'd changed it, they wouldn't have cared at all, because it was a shooting script, and they didn't want me messing around with it. I'm not a script writer or a cinematographer, but the film sort of almost came out within about 6 or 7 months from then, because they managed to get the cast together. There was Tony Curtis, of course, and Susan Strasberg, and Burgess Meredith, and Michael Ansara, and Stella Stevens, which was a really stellar cast for a film like that. That was extraordinary how he got the cast together. I only found out later that he managed to get them all together because they all had divorce payments to make, and they thought, right, actually so did I at the time, so all of us, it was sort of divorcees horror film. and I had nothing to do with the production of the film whatsoever. They just had it, they made it, and when it was made, they rang up and they said, come to the screening. So they flew us out to Los Angeles, and we went to Culver City and sat and watched the film. And I actually think, considering when it was made in about 1975 or 76, I think it was quite good, and I think quite scary. And the effects were as good as they could possibly do in those days. They couldn't do CGI like they do today. But I think what really made it good was the acting, and Tony Curtis in particular became the character that was in my book. Harry Erskine, who was this fake astrologer, he lived it as it was as a character in the book. He was just really, really good. I don't think he even remembered making the film afterwards, but I just think he was brilliant. And despite all of its shortcomings, the technical shortcomings, the film has become a horror classic. You can still get it on DVD, you know, if you're so inclined. But no, I was quite happy with it, actually. The only sad thing, I think, is that I haven't had more feature films made like that. None of the above. I think it's very difficult to explain exactly what the creative process is when you start writing a novel. But I was trained as a newspaper reporter from the age of 17, and so I was always trained to look for stories. You might see that outside in the square, somebody might attack somebody else. A mad person might jump on somebody and hurt them, and people say, "Oh God, that's dreadful. Take him to hospital." But I was, as a newspaper reporter, I was trained to look at that and said, "Who attacked this person? Why did they do it? What's the background? What's the motive?" And get a story out of it, something that you could actually explain to people in the newspaper. And that's where the novels came from. Because I was talking to you about the Manitou, saying that the old story of the Red Indian demons from the Buffalo, the old cowboy annuals I read when I was a boy, and mixing that with my wife's pregnancy, you get two elements together that make a story. And an awful lot of my stories come from mixing like an ancient demon from ancient mythology, like medieval times, and making this appear in the present day so that ordinary people like us have to deal with it. But how do we deal with it? Because, I mean, in the Middle Ages, if your child was sick or something terrible happened to you, you got struck by lightning or your cattle died, you didn't know, you had no idea about bacteria or cot death or any of that sort of thing. So it was always usually explained by saying it was a witch or a demon or something had come in the night and strangled my child, you know, although it might have just been suffocation. But what I do is to take, and these days we know about a lot more about science and why people die suddenly and what various threats are, what the illnesses are, and how you know we can deal with them scientifically. I mean, they still frighten us. I'm not saying they don't, but the fear that people felt in the Middle Ages when they didn't know why this suddenly and unexpectedly happened, they made into demons. They described, you know, the fear as a thing, or a witch, or a horned demon, or Satan, or Asmodeus, or any of these demons. I mean, in Scotland, when they had a cot death, they thought it was the Glastigs, who were the witches who came along and suffocated your child while it was asleep because you wouldn't let them have any milk from your cows. You know, they thought it was witches. And there's all kinds of, I mean, there are so many demons like that. You know, I would have subjects to write about for the rest of my life and more. So that's where the ideas start. I'll see something that maybe happens in a news story that happens in the present day and say, well, you know, maybe that could have been caused by some ancient threat from, you know, from beyond. So just mix the two together, and it becomes a story. It becomes a horror story. So that's how that happens. But when I sit down and write it, I think of a kind of character it's going to happen to. I mean, like Harry Erskine in The Manitou, who's just a not very good fortune teller. And I do try and make the people ordinary, because another important ingredient in the story is to give them ordinary problems, the same sort of problems we all face, like haven't got enough money, or the kids are misbehaving, or something like that, because that gives an added reality to what's going to happen next. So having created that character, then I'll sort of introduce the threat. But and the other thing I will always do is make sure the book is set somewhere that's very realistic, very real, because then the story does become much more convincing. If you go to any of, particularly the more recent books I've done, like this one, was it Chavoni Hotel, the Red Hotel, that's set in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. You can find every bar, every street, every restaurant in there. If you could almost use that as a guidebook to going around Baton Rouge if you wanted to. So it's completely off, and that really roots the story in reality. So when the ghastly, horrible, scary thing happens, the reader, I hope anyway, is already believing, identifying with the character, and believing in the background. So that makes it more scary, because, you know, suddenly they feel that they're there. Just when I came yesterday and was talking to a woman in Warsaw, she said, the last book of yours I read, she said I had to keep turning round while I was reading it to make sure I was still at home and I wasn't in the book, you know. And that was a very big compliment. I was very pleased with that, because I worked very hard to do that. Well, what I really like to do, I do sometimes steal fairy stories or stories from other books. Like Mirror was, of course, based on Alice Through the Looking Glass, and the story Flesh and Blood was based on. It's both a Czech legend and also an English legend about the Green Man and his companions who come round and expect all kinds of things in return for not being very nasty to people. But the main thing about it is that a lot of people know these stories. It's like with Family Portrait, which was based on Oscar Wilde's story of the portrait of Dorian Gray, the portrait up in the attic that gets older and more horrible while the young man downstairs stays as beautiful and handsome as ever. But I thought that was a great idea for a story, but I wanted to explain it in a different way, to give people a shock by suddenly seeing a story which they knew well and with which they were very familiar, and just seeing it from another point of view. It was perhaps a bit more scary than Oscar Wilde or Lewis Carroll intended these things to be. But I think people like having this. Of course, it's really a false explanation, but I think people like having another viewpoint put on something they already know about. God, you know, that Alice and Through the Looking Glass story, it's not really about Alice and not really about a little girl, it's about how to find Satan. And I think people get pleasure out of it, like pleasures out of a puzzle that they've solved, which is really where this comes from. But it's like with a book called Prey. I can't remember what it was called in Poland, but it was it featured a little character from H.P. Lovecraft, Brown Jenkin, who was a kind of half rat, half human, who spoke in all kinds of different languages. And I loved that character from the H.P. Lovecraft story, so I actually borrowed him and put him in a story of my own, just as an incidental, horrible character to put into the story. Yeah. So it's really just to give the reader pleasure by recognising something familiar and yet seeing it from a completely different light. The really difficult thing about finding a place to live is that anytime I go anywhere, I meet people, excuse me, I meet people, make friends, and want to stay there. Fisher and I, when we first got together, lived in London, and when we had our first child, we said, "Oh, let's bring the child up in the countryside." So we moved down to a place called Epsom, which is near the Derby racecourse in Surrey, which is a very lovely place. It's right up on top of the Downs, and you can see London from one side, and then you can almost see the cliffs for the sea on the other side. So you can be 20 minutes into London and then 20 minutes down to the sea. So that's where I live now, actually, because it's a lovely place to live. But we lived in Ireland, well, I'll be quite frank about it, for income tax reasons, because they didn't charge income tax on writers or artists. That's why a lot of famous actors live in Ireland. And what I had to do was send off my books and show that this was how I made my living. And the Irish tax commissioners wrote back and said, "Yes, that's fine. You qualify." So we lived in Cork for 5 years and obviously saved ourselves 5 years of income tax. It was really nice to get a tax return that says you made so much, you're responsible for naught. That's really nice. But we missed our family in the end, and it rains in Ireland an awful lot. It does rain. By God, it rains there. But, so we came home, but we made a lot of friends there. And I've developed a whole new series of books while I was there about an Irish detective, which have been doing very well, incidentally, at the moment. Number 2 in the Kindle bestsellers today, White Bones, which was published originally here by Rabius as a book called Katie Maguire. It's about an Irish woman detective. So I've got something out of that. But Poland is, apart from the fact I've worked out I'm probably 1/16 Polish myself, because my great-grandfather was Polish. My wife Wieszka, my late wife Wieszka, was Polish. She had never been to Poland until 1989, because she was born in Germany in a displaced persons camp, and then went to England. But when they started publishing I managed to. They said to us, we can't pay you for that. We can't pay you for that book. They said we can, because the zloty wasn't convertible into dollars or pounds. So we said, but I said, oh, I don't know, let's do it then. You know, not making money out of it. But Vieshka said, oh no, she said, it's Poland, and they're offering to take us to Poland and show us. So that was our first trip to Poland in 1989. It was a bit grim in those days, I'm afraid to say, but and it's got better and better and better and better ever since. But we both felt, well, to put it quite frankly, we both felt that our hearts were here in Poland. When I come to Poland, it really feels like coming home, and particularly since Fisher has died as well. I get a feeling of her spirit is here, which is why I like coming. I don't know whether I'd come to live here. I mean, I love coming, but I've got 3 sons at home and grandchildren, and it's very hard to tear yourself away from those, especially my little granddaughter. But I do feel very much at home here, I must say. I really do. And I just get off the plane, it's like, oh, phew. It's you know, I'm back home again.
Do you have any favorite place in Poland? Cities?
Any favourites?
Yeah.
Poznań for sure.
Poznan's great.
Really?
Poznan. I'm to Poznan at once.
Poznań, no, how?
Poznan. I love Poznan. We love Poznan. There's an English comedian who goes on tour all around the country, and every city he goes to, he says, "Welcome to Coventry" or "Welcome to Birmingham." My favourite city of all.
You can be completely honest.
I'm honest. I love Poznan. I haven't actually been here long. Krakow is like the only thing that puts me off about Krakow and Wrocław. I love Wrocław as well. I love it, and I like Gdynia as well, and lots of I like Gdansk and Gdynia as well too. Both of them, I've been to both, and Bielsko-Biała, I like. It's lovely, and so it's hard to. I don't know. I like them all because they're all different. And even these days, I didn't like it when I first went there all those years ago in 1989 in Katowice. In those days, it was all the air was yellow, but it's a lot better than it used to be. But yeah, no, I would. Perhaps later on, I might consider actually coming and living here. But at the moment, you know, with little grandchildren, and it's difficult to tear myself away. We were going to go and live in America. We bought a house or nearly bought a house in Connecticut, a very nice place called New Milford. But unfortunately, I couldn't get a green card for anything. Just couldn't get one. We've got too many goddamn authors here already. We don't want another one. Answer to question 1. I don't think there are any borders, but there's a caveat to that, and that is you can only really cross moral borders. You can only really go to the very edges of outrage if what you do is really very well written. You can't write something crude and it's written badly. It takes very much better writing to do something outrageous than it does. It really does. And I've several times deliberately gone out to sat down, written a short story that I've on purpose gone to the very edge of what I think is acceptable. I think the classic example was a story called Eric the Pie. It's Eric the Pasty or something it was called in Poland. And it's about a boy who eats animals and people for his own pleasure. And it goes very, very close to the edge. And I did it deliberately. In fact, it featured in the first edition of a new horror magazine in England called Frighteners, which is going to be the new horror short story magazine. And it got the magazine banned, and the magazine folded because of that story, Eric the Pie. And then I wrote a story called Sepsis, which was absolutely disgusting. I don't know whether you like it, but a man gives his his new bride a cat for a present, and something nasty happens to the cat and something nasty happens to them. It is very nasty. But I did it on purpose to see how far I could go. But at each time it was, it has to be so well written that you still keep the reader's attention. They don't say, oh, this is horrible. And the last story, which will be appearing quite shortly in I've got a new collection of short stories coming out, is called Beholder. And it's about a young girl who's actually born quite ugly. And she doesn't realise it, and mother always keeps her away from everybody else and says, you're my little princess, you're so beautiful that nobody can look at you. But she begins to blame other people for looking at her, for making her ugly. So she starts to go for their eyes, because that's where her beauty has been taken, has been stolen into their eyes. And it gets quite, it does get a bit, you know, if you're worried about your eyes at all, it makes you wince a bit. But yes, I do it on purpose. And also there are some sexual stories I've written that go very, very close to the edge. But again, I think it has to be quality, and it has to have good reason, a good moral purpose behind the story, or good characterization. You know, you can't do something cheap and badly like that. I did it because I was working before I worked for Penthouse, I worked for a magazine called Mayfair, which was a competitor to Penthouse. And Penthouse had lots of very sexy letters, which were a great feature of the magazine, and sold it very well every month. And we needed at Mayfair, their competitors, something to compete with that. So we sat down one evening and I said, I know, let's do a kind of question and answer. Talk to people about their sex lives and what's wrong with it. So it'll be quite sexy, but at the same time, at the end of the thing, it will give an answer to what their problem is. A kind of living, breathing agony column for people. So we started doing that. It was very successful, but I left the magazine then. After that, though, an American publisher came to me and said they'd seen that column. Would I do a book? In the same way, anecdotal, and you'll find most of my sex books are very anecdotal and based on talking to real people. So that's what I did, and that's how it started, and that one was so successful. I saw no reason to stop, and I was, as I say, I was on a bit of a crusade for women being treated properly, and being understood, especially sexually, and it all just blossomed out of that. Well, I mean, some books work better than others, obviously. You can't do not every single book's going to turn out absolutely amazingly, and I do like to, what I call, throw myself off a cliff and write something different and new all the time, and sometimes it works better than others. And so all books to that extent are a problem, because I deliberately give myself a challenge to do something new. It's like when I wrote a vampire novel called Descendant. It was a short book, and it was about vampires, which I don't normally like writing about. But it was difficult to write, and some people absolutely loved it and some people didn't. You know, you have to accept that some people are going to like what you do and some people hate it. But I've never been discouraged by a book. I've never given up on a book, because it's what I do. I mean, I'm telling a story, and some books are difficult to write because of the research, or the plot's a little bit difficult to work out, but that's part of the challenge of the job. You know, I get up in the morning, sit down at 10 o'clock, and I create other worlds until 6, and then I go to the pub. I'd just like to say to everybody who participates in lubimyczytać, thank you for your interest. It really is appreciated. And the one thing I will say more than anything else to you is that I've never considered readers to be fans. I don't like the word fans, because all of my readers are readers and friends. So I hope very much you enjoy everything that I've written already and everything that I'm going to write with you in mind.